Almost without thinking, I raised my pistol in my left hand and fired again. A number of shots in rapid succession, straight into that huge and stinking maw. The back of the creature's head exploded, taking whatever brains it had with it. It staggered, staring at me in vapid astonishment for a moment before toppling from the hole to impact against the vitrified sand beneath. With a crack vaguely reminiscent of someone breaking into the largest plate in the galaxy, I whirled around to face our original attackers, to find that Jurgen had switched his lasgun to full auto and was hosing them down with the same vindictive enthusiasm Valhallans generally displayed while slaughtering their hereditary enemies. Caught in the blizzard of lasbolts, the two greenskins staggered at last, dropping to the sand and rolling to the side of the dunes, to leak out the last of their lives in what I expected to be no more than a moment or two of feeble twitching. To my astonishment, however, they began crawling back towards us, the lust for bloodshed still burning in their eyes, until a couple of more carefully placed shots from my imperturbable aide blew their brains apart like overripe melons. Well done, Jurgen, I began, when my aide's head snapped around, and he began trying to bring his weapon to bear in my direction. Look out, Commissar! He yelled, still trying to find a target. And forewarned by his cry, I was able to bring my chainsword up just in time. With a roar which left my already abused ears ringing, the orc whose comrade had so casually struck it down charged at me, swinging its cleaver again. Unbelievably, the head wound, which would have proved fatal to a man had it seemed, barely stunned it, and the belly wounds I'd inflicted hardly slowed it at all. Ignoring the atavistic voice in the back of my head, which gibbered in panic, at the creature's seeming invulnerability, I moved instinctively to counter its rush. It wasn't unkillable. We had 4 pieces of evidence to prove it, lying all around us. I just needed to finish its weak point. I just needed to find its weak point. In the meantime, a slash across the torso from my trusty chain blade ought to slow it a bit. I swung the weapon, ducking under a massive forearm, and was rewarded with another roar of anger as my blade connected. Ichor continued to pump from the gash in its skull, as I danced away, trying to open the distance between us, to give Jurgen a clear shot at the thing, before it was hellish fast, and closed with me again before I could do so. It blinkered, trying to clear its vision, and I took advantage of its momentary distraction to get in under its guard, striking at its leg. The humming blade struck deep, whining against the bone for a moment, and the greenskin staggered, bellowing another challenge. For the first time, it seemed less sure of itself, its movements a little less controlled, and I evaded another desperate swing of its axe with an almost contemptuous ease. The blow had been a wild one, and I countered it easily, taking the creature's arm just below the elbow, with a gush of foul-smelling fluid that sprayed the surrounding sand and hull, missing me by millimeters. That ought to have been enough to subdue my opponent, but once again, I underestimated the orc capacity for berserker rage and lack of instinct for self-preservation. Instead of collapsing, it surged to its feet, roaring just as loudly as before. Staggering enough, I sidestepped, striking at its back, and severed the thing's spinal column. It fell fast, strolling down to join its comrades, and twitched for a moment before finally becoming still. Nice work, sir, Jurgen said, lowering his weapon. I looked around us, breathing hard, not quite daring to believe it was all over at last. Is that the last of them? I asked. My aide nodded. Must be, he said, with assurance I quite envied. But then his people had generations of experience fighting these creatures, so I suppose he had good reason for his confidence. If there were any more, they'd be all over us by now. Well, that's a comfort, I said, with less sarcasm than I'd intended. But the obvious question struck me. What I want to know is how they found us so fast. As it turned out, the answer to that question lay close at hand, and we were able to find it after a relatively brief search. The task was pretty onerous. However, as both of us were all still suffering the effects of our precipitous descent, and the heat of the desert would have been debilitating enough, even if we'd both been on the peak of conditions to begin with. Not for the first time, I cursed, however. It was who had originally decided that black would be the ideal color of a commissarial uniform, and discarded the greatcoat, which, in the normal course of events, I found extremely welcome, surrounded as I usually was by ice worlders, who tended to adjust the temperature in their quarters to levels more usually reserved for preservation of food. Jurgen, no doubt, found the high temperatures even more onerous than I did, but accepted them as he did everything else, with his habitual stoicism. I'd insisted on resting for a while before commencing our scouting expedition, grabbing some food and water, and was heartily glad I had done so, despite the presence of our uninvited guest besides the pod. The temperature within had risen considerably, and as you can well imagine, the scent of barking oak wasn't exactly a spur to the appetite. After a while, and with considerable effort, we were able to lug the cadaver outside, where it joined its comrades in a makeshift charnel heap. "We ought to burn them," Jurgen said, which I gathered was some sort of superstition among the Valhallans. Although, since the greenskins were all indisputably dead, I couldn't really see the point. It was moot anyways, the arms locker aboard our little craft not having any flamers among its inventory. So we deferred the matter in favor of exploration and set out in the direction from which our attackers had come. Fortunately, the tracks they had left were easy to follow, and after some moments of floundering up and down the shifting sands of the endless dune fields, we reached one of the narrow, rocky defiles the Telerans call wadis. There, the furrows they'd left in their wake died away, although the occasional boot print was still visible in the thin scattering of dust, which coated the ground, and we were able to make reasonable progress. In fact, now we were free of the encumbering sand in which we had sunk our ankles with every step. I felt almost invigorated, despite the all-pervasive heat. By this time, we were both perspiring freely, and I paused for a moment to take a mouthful of water from the canteen I'd slung over one shoulder before we set off. As I did so, I caught sight of a bright flash of reflected sunlight from around the next turn of the defile, and motioned Jurgen to silence. Something metallic was up ahead, and that much was certain, although what it was we still had no idea. Readying our weapons, we moved on cautiously, my mouth drier now than it had been before I'd stopped to drink, and the palms of my hands tingling again, although this time it was simply from nerves rather than warning my subconscious. Several times during that painstaking advance, my eyes registered that telltale flickering again, although what had presaged it, I still had no idea. At length, we reached the bend in the defile, and flattening ourselves against the rock walls, peered cautiously around it. My breath hissed involuntarily through my teeth. "Vehicles," I said, although in truth, that was paying them something of an unwarranted compliment. Had we a tech priest with us, I'm not sure whether he would have burst out laughing on the spot or tried to exorcise them as some abomination against the machine spirit. Both probably useful, as they were on the occasion. I had to say, most of the cogboys I'd come across in my long and discreditable career have been the proverbial emperor short of a tarot deck. Jurgen nodded. "Orcish," he pronounced, with all the assurance of his heritage, although even I had been able to tell that. There were three of the things parked in a wider canyon, and to which the wadi we followed out like a tributary joining river. And I'd never seen a more ramshackle collection of vehicles in my life. Two were a curious hybrid of tractor and motorcycle, with wide tracks in the rear, where wheels should have been. One clearly intended for a single rider, and the other two of the elongated treads side by side, separated by a flatbed in which was mounted a large and imitating heavy weapon, clearly intended to be fired by a passenger. It was this which had been responsible for the flashing I'd seen. The crude sighting device attached to it had come loose, shifting slightly in the wind, intermittently deflecting the blazing sun up the narrow side canyon we'd been following. The third member of the convoy looked a little more conventional, being mounted on four sturdy wheels. Like its curious companion, it had a pintle-mounted weapon, which I recognized as an Imperial pattern heavy bolter, no doubt looted and installed by whatever debased equivalent of our own tech priest those grotesque creatures possessed. Scanning the whole area with an amplivisor from the well-stocked lockers of our life pod, and detecting no signs of life, I gave the signal to descend. Close to the collection of ambulatory scrap we'd chanced across was even less promising. The four-wheeled specimen, which Jurgen had been referring to as a buggy, was well armored, it was true, thick slabs of metal, crudely riveted to the chassis, but it had clearly been poorly maintained, if it had ever been at all. Patches of rust and bright silver scoring were scattered randomly across its surface. The latter, no doubt, having been inflicted in combat recently, enough not to have been oxidized yet, for reasons I couldn't quite fathom. A thick of red paint had been crudely daubed among the flanks. "This must have been the boss's," my aide opinioned, climbing up the thing and poking around cautiously. After a moment, I joined him, keeping a wary eye out for any betraying flash of movement among the scattering rocks which surrounded us, and inspected the bolter from force of habit. It seemed fully functional, loaded, and several boxes of ammunition were still stacked haphazardly around it. "How can you tell?" I asked, deferring to his greater knowledge of the creatures we faced without a trace of embarrassment. We'd served together long enough for me to have more confidence in him than anyone else in the regiment, and he knew me well enough not to take a willingness to listen to advice as a sign of weak leadership. In fact, one of the things I got out of my way to try and instill in the young whelps in my charge was to do precisely that. Better a moment of embarrassment than a lifetime of ignorance, if you ask me. And on the battlefield, where what you don't know is most definitely going to hurt you, that's a liability. Besides, there's nothing better calculated to get the guard officers you'll be serving with to loosen up a bit and establish a tolerable working order relationship with them. Jurgen shrugged. "It's got the biggest guns," he pointed out reasonably. Well, that made sense to me, so I prized myself from the precious bolter and started rummaging through the storage lockers in earnest. Apart from a crude collection of tools, evidently used to repair whatever damage couldn't be ignored altogether, there didn't seem to be much, although one proved to contain a human arm, desiccated by the desert heat, thoroughly chewed and smelling to the golden throne. "Somebody's lunch," I suggested, pitching the foul thing over the side and trying to quell the incipient rebellion in my stomach. Jurgen nodded grimly. "They'll eat anything, even each other." "How nice," I said, with a shudder of revulsion. After that, I opened my lungs a bit more circumspectly, as you might expect, but there were no more unpleasant surprises. "I take it the others were carrying the rest of the rations?" Perhaps fortunately, there was no sign of anything an orc might consider food on either of the vehicles. "Must have been the foraging party," Jurgen concluded, and I nodded in agreement. "The question is," I said, where were they going to forage? And where'd they come from in the first place? I shivered in a sudden gust of chill wind. We'd taken longer than I'd expected to inspect our find, and the sun was beginning to get close to the horizon. Our short sojourn in Desoladia had familiarized me with desert conditions well enough, so I knew that the temperature was about to drop to levels which Jurgen would find positively welcome, and I most certainly wouldn't. We'd better get back to the pod. We could work out shelter there for a night at least, and try to work out what to do next. We could hardly stay there indefinitely. But on the other hand, I had no desire to strike out anything random across this wilderness of sand, trusting to blind luck and the Emperor We'd find our own lines before another orc patrol stumbled across us. Of course, I hadn't the faintest idea at the time how far actually we were from the bulk of Imperial forces on Perlia, or I would probably have been gibbering in panic by now. My aide nodded. Would this help? He asked, preferring a tattered scrap of parchment he'd found in one of the lockers of the buggy. I took it, finding it unpleasantly greasy to the touch, and examined the spiderwork of crude lines and strange orc sigils spattered across it, apparently at random. It looks like a map,